on one of his campaign promises, eliminating the Department of Education.
What I want to do is let the states run schools. I believe strongly in school choice, but in addition to that, I want the states to run schools.
The Trump administration reportedly started to draft an executive order that could eventually get rid of the department. And President Trump is also expected to urge Congress to pass legislation to close the agency. That idea already has the backing from Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson.
The teachers' unions will viciously fight, of course, any idea of disbanding the federal Department of Education. But I think the principle is one that is, the time has come. We've all seen the ratings. I mean, the U.S. is falling far behind other countries because the system is not working.
Joining us now is Kevin Welner, the director of the National Education Policy Center at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Mr. Welner, thank you for joining us.
It's nice to be here, Victoria.
So besides wanting the states to run schools, why do you think President Trump wants to eliminate the Education Department?
Well, I think that there's a question about whether or not that really would further the goal of states running schools. The rhetoric is certainly that the Department of Education should not be, or the federal government should not be the nation's school board. But President Trump so far has been more aggressive than most presidents in terms of issuing edicts around vaccines and DEI and CRT and trans students. And there's a proposal for a $10 billion voucher program out of DC. But I think that the Department of Education, the idea of eliminating it, has a symbolic message that the federal government should not be the nation's school board. So I think we're seeing a tension or confusing hypocrisy, whatever it is, between the two different types of messages.
Well, if that is the message, and let's say it does come to fruition, how would our education in each of the states really differ from each other? The federal government kind of has the overseeing power of everything. If each state takes control, what do you think that would do?
So eliminating the Department of Education doesn't in and of itself change the programs that Congress has created and funded. So the major programs in higher education and K-12 would continue. They would just continue and be administered in other departments. So think here about IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which helps to fund and sets rules for the education of students with disabilities. That would likely move to the Department of Health and Human Services, which is where it existed before 1979 when the Department of Education was created. If the federal government really does take a step back and Congress decides to defund or lessen the funding for these programs, that would certainly have a major effect on the states. But simply eliminating the Department of Education moves the chairs around, but it doesn't change those programs.
So other agencies would then pick up the slack that was left behind if an entity were to leave. So we heard from Speaker Johnson that he supports this idea of getting rid of the Department of Education. Could this go through without full congressional support?
No, the Congress created the department as well as the programs that the department is administering, and Congress would have to vote to eliminate the department. And there have been votes along the way or proposals along the way to do that. They have not received support from the majority of Congress. In fact, there are quite a few Republicans who have resisted the idea, opposed the idea of eliminating the Department of Education. And when the department was created back in 1979, there were a lot of Republican co-sponsors in the Senate to create the department in the first place.
Could this make, if it does go through, let's say that the department does get dismantled, some of the programs get moved to other agencies, would this make it difficult for maybe some underperforming states to catch up to the higher performing states, or would this level the playing field?
So the issue, I think, is what the Department of Education currently does, and here we're focusing on the K-12 issue, not higher education, because the department does do a lot in the higher education realm as well. But in terms of K-12, the largest program that the department administers is what's called Title I, or Title IA is the big part of that. And that's the funding that goes to support schools that serve students from low-income families. And what we see is there's a very stark red-blue pattern where the states that voted for Donald Trump receive a lot more of their school funding from the federal government, mainly through Title I, than do the states that voted for Kamala Harris. So in other words, the states that are red tend to rely a lot more on Title I funding than the blue states. There are only two exceptions. New Mexico is a blue state that relies quite a bit on federal fund support, and Kansas is a red state that relies on a percentage of federal support that's significantly below the national average. Other than that, you see a fairly clear pattern across the country in terms of which states rely more on federal support. So Title I cuts would hit low spending or low wealth states more, and those tend to be the redder states. And these states sometimes have very impoverished rural areas with enormous need for these resources. Alaska, for example, has quite a few school districts that receive more than $10,000 in federal funding per pupil.
And those funding allocations, not necessarily connected to voting for Trump, since he's only been in office the second term for about 3 weeks now, but you're talking about Democrat and Republican lines.
Right. So what we're seeing, the underlying patterns of voting and the underlying patterns of Title I receipt are probably connected to the demographics of the state in other ways. And I mentioned states that have a lot of need for Title I oftentimes have impoverished rural areas, and those areas did vote for Donald Trump quite a bit.
Is there anything that you are focusing on that maybe the general public isn't looking at or isn't seeing right now, since this is your main focus is education and how this might impact schools across the country? Anything that we're missing?
Well, I think it's important to dig down and think about what it is the department is doing. So there is clearly a symbolic value, as I mentioned earlier, in the administration eliminating the Department of Education. But I think it's important to think beyond the symbolic value and think about what it's doing. That money is used to pay for critical instructional needs like teachers and tutors and after-school programs. And, all children deserve the educational resources and opportunities to learn, no matter their state or who their parents or neighbors voted for. So I hope that these patterns I'm talking about and understanding these patterns help congressional representatives to understand what's at stake for their constituents.
Kevin Welner, the director of the National Education Policy Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. We appreciate your insight.
My pleasure, Victoria.
And we'll be right back.